Hello, welcome to my introductory Pilates session. It occurred to me when I recorded my first little bit on Wednesday from the response I've had on Facebook that a few people might be watching my subsequent videos with Pilates routines in that haven't done Pilates with me before. So it occurred to me that perhaps I should do a little session explaining the basics, explaining some of the fundamentals that we're trying to achieve with Pilates so that when you do the routines with me, they make a bit more sense, you understand why you're doing them. It could also be useful, even if you've been doing Pilates with me for a long time, because we never get time to explain the things I'm going to explain for the next few minutes. It still might be of use to watch this video. So this is all just a bit about the physiology, the reason we do Pilates and why we do Pilates. And then to follow, there will be videos with various routines for you to follow. Okay, so let me start with the basics. Pilates is a form of exercise named after a person, Joseph Pilates. He created this exercise system. And although in many ways it has evolved since his time, the basics are still there. And his fundamental concern, and therefore the fundamental concern with Pilates, is developing strength in musculature that supports your body when you're standing still, when you're moving, when you're sitting. Any of your postures, the muscles that we develop with Pilates are there to improve those postures. And functional posture as well, when you're bending, twisting, lifting, moving generally. It's all about making your body perform better. Unlike other forms of exercise, it's not about puff and puff, it's not about sweat, it's not about getting your heart rate up, it's about engaging and firing muscles that are going to make your body better perform the things your body needs to do. So we call it functional exercise. The muscles we primarily talk about in Pilates are the core muscles. And the core muscles are fundamentally made up of a big muscle that goes round you like a corset called the transversus abdominis. These muscles are going to be like a cylinder, so the transversus abdominis is the wall of the cylinder. The diaphragm, a sheet of muscle through the base of the rib cage, is the top of the cylinder. Your pelvic floor is the base of the cylinder, and you have some additional little muscles close to the base of the spine, or rather close to either side of the spine, and running all the way down to the base of the spine called multifidi. They're part of the cylinder as well. And all those muscles, when they fire normally and naturally, they give the spine a lot of support. No matter what the spine is doing, whether it's still, whether it's bending, whether it's rotating, they give the spine support for those activities. But in many people have lost the ability to fire those muscles. Sometimes it's because the muscles have become weak, so we need to strengthen them. But very often, it's because the brain's forgotten how to talk to those muscles. And so a lot of Pilates exercises are quite subtle in that it's getting you to feel and work those muscles so that your brain goes, oh, that's how I do it, that's how I get those muscles to fire. And then we do exercises to strengthen the muscles as well. So if they are weak muscles, they are stronger by the exercise. And if you're not firing by doing the exercise, you learn how to fire them. And the two things come together and you get good functional support of your spine. So it's about getting muscles that might be lazy, getting them firing, getting muscles that might be weak, stronger, and the combination together is what we're trying to achieve. Now they're the component, well that's the objective of Pilates. And we do that we achieve that by these structured, very controlled exercises. And one thing about Pilates is that the exercises, the slower you do them and the more correct form you have whilst you are doing them, you will get more out of the Pilates exercises. So that's the basics, and let me talk about a little bit about anatomy to make that hopefully make a bit more sense or a bit more context. You have your spine, and your spine's a very important structure because that's the thing, that's the skeletal structure that supports your upper body weight and transmits that weight down into and through the legs. Your spine is not a rigid structure, although you see some people walk and you think perhaps it is a rigid structure, but the spine isn't rigid. It allows rotation, it allows side bending, it allows forward and backward bending. So the vertebrae that make up the spine have to have movement, but when I'm carrying a heavy load, they've got to be sufficiently supported and still and motionless in that support to allow me to carry that load successfully through the body without causing damage. So we have this sort of almost like conflict. The vertebrae have to be mobile, but they have to be, when necessary, strong enough to carry loads. And that's where these muscles come in. So the muscles are partly to enable us to get to the pelvis and hold it in the right position, and then to keep it in the right position, even though we might be doing things with our body that would tend the spine to come out of position. One of the key things we talk about in Pilates a lot is the curvature in the small of your back. The spine has a number of curves. It has an inward curvature in the neck, an outward curvature at the back of the rib cage, an inward curvature in the base of the spine, and a slight fixed outward curvature in your going down towards your tailbone. Well, the inward curvature here, which is called your lumbar lordosis, that curve is changeable. We've got the muscular wherewithal and the mobility in joints for that curve to change. And in the ideal, the spine here has just a little bit of inward curvature, and that is optimal for load bearing through the spine. But many people have postural faults where the curve is perhaps flattened or the curve is too much. And both of those positions will put extra load on the vertebrae, the discs between the vertebrae, and that can cause a problem. So one of the things we educate with Pilates is making aware of this natural curve and the right amount of curve. And it's called neutral spine. And you'll hear it a lot in Pilates videos. They talk about neutral spine, they talk about getting into neutral spine, and they talk about maintaining neutral spine when they're doing exercise. So that's this awareness that you can change the amount of curvature in the back, get the right amount of curvature, and then when you've got the right amount of curvature, learn how to maintain it using musculature of the core that we introduced a moment ago, firing it when you need to maintain that spine shape. So, to make you aware of changing the curve in the small of the back, we do something called a pelvic tilt. So you can't see my bones, but imagine you could. This is my pelvis. I've got two big bony prominences here. They're the front of the pelvis. This is my pelvic structure. I have my pubic bone here, my tailbone here, which is sort of the base, front and back of the pelvis. And here is my rib cage. That is me tracing the shape of my bottom rib. Here is coming up the rib cage. And it's in that space between the ribs and the pelvis that we have the core musculature, essentially. Well, my pelvis is a structure that I can move independently of the rest of my spine. And the way I do that, we do this a lot, we do it in the warm-up in my Pilates routine, is place the heel of the hands on the bony crest at the front of the pelvis, put the middle fingers down towards your pubic bone, down there, just above your nether regions. And if you move your pelvis, what should happen? The pubic bone will alternately come forwards, and alternately, the tailbone will go backwards. So I've got this range of motion by moving the pelvis. Now many people, when they first try it, don't have the motor skills to be able to do that exercise. I ask them to do a pelvic tilt, and what happens is they principally pull a face because they can't work out, well, how do I get this pelvis to move? So it's a skill in its own right to be able to perform a good pelvic move. So in this, one purpose of this video is to get you being able to perform a pelvic tilt and get you to practice a pelvic tilt. So the pelvic tilt is the action where you draw the pubic bone forwards and the tailbone backwards, but in a way that doesn't move the ribs and doesn't move the legs. Because I could, for example, get my pelvis tilt by thrusting my spine backwards. Well, that's not me moving my pelvis independently of everything else. That's me just leaning back through my spine, and that's anatomically not what I want. I equally could get my pelvis to move by bending the knees. It's what I call the evening all action. The old style copper bending his knees. That again is achieving a pelvic tilt, but it's not doing it using the right muscles. So when we try and do a good quality pelvic tilt, I don't want the ribs to move, I don't want the legs to move. So when I do the movement, and because I've got my hands sandwiching the pelvis, you can see because the tilt of my hands is changing, that I am actually achieving that pelvic tilt. Now very often when I'm doing this in a clinic situation, is I'll get someone to stand against a wall and achieve that pelvic tilt movement. And the beauty of against a wall is that if you imagine the back of my head and my shoulders are against a wall, and this bit of my spine's against the wall, when I pelvic tilt, those bits can't move because the wall is going to stop them. So I can't do that because the wall's in the way. I can't sort of lean backwards because the wall stops me doing that. So it's a good discipline. This room, I've just noticed, has one of these rails all the way around. So if I can find maybe a door, I might move the camera in a minute and edit into the video of me standing against the door so you can see that. So that might happen, it might not. But essentially, I want you to pelvic tilt without moving the bit. So if I put one hand bottom rib and the other hand in the small of my back, what you can see is by achieving or doing the pelvic tilt properly, I'm not moving my ribs, I'm changing the curve in the small of my back, and I'm not doing it by dropping the knee. So that's a good thing to practice, and you may see me do it in front of a bit of wall if I can find some wall to do that. So pelvic tilting is a good exercise, and generally speaking, when we have the right curvature in the small of your back, your pelvis is in vertical. And what we mean by that is the bony crest here, and you can always find a bony crest by bouncing the heel of the hand off a bone, and that's the best way to find it. Do it each side, aim the middle finger down towards your pubic bone, and the backs of the hands will look vertical. So it's not tilted that way, it's not tilted that way, it's in vertical. And pragmatically, it's sort of halfway between the furthest forward you can go that way and the furthest you can go that way. That's not a rigid rule because some people might have restrictions But essentially, if you can get the pelvis vertical, and of course that's when you're standing, if you are lying down, the pelvis will be horizontal relative to the ground. Get it in that position, and that is probably then creating the right curvature in the small of your back, creating neutral spine. So that's the first thing to do, to try and create neutral spine, be aware of neutral spine, try and get practice in always wanting your pelvis or your spine to be in neutral spine position, and that becomes a good skill to practice. And when we do Pilates exercises, we put the pelvis in neutral, get the right curve, and then I'll get you to do something with your arms and legs typically, which if you've got no control of these muscles, will take the pelvis out of neutral. And so the purpose of the exercise is to challenge you to, once you've got neutral, keep it in neutral in spite of swinging the leg around, moving the arms around and so on. And if I stand sideways on, I'm going to give you an example of that. Hopefully my clothes reveal a sufficient, you can see what's going on. But if I put the natural curve in the small back, I'll do it that way. So my hands here, I've got that sense of vertical in the pelvis, I've got my hand in the small of my back here. If I do a knee lift very carefully, I can do that without causing any change in either the position of the ribs or the shape of my back, do it nice and under control. That's doing it in sort of a Pilates way. Some people, when they knee lift, they do that. Now, if you notice, if I go to that top point, my ribs are flared backwards, I've curved the spine of the weight, and I've tilted the pelvis that way, so I've lost neutral. So the Pilates challenge of doing a knee lift is lift the knee as high as you can without losing neutral spine. So if we're doing a knee lift in Pilates, we lift the knee up, aiming to get the thigh as up as we can, but don't lose neutral. Don't let the pelvis start tucking under, the pubic bone coming forward. So you go as high as you can. And often what you'll find with any muscle, be it a stretch or a muscular engagement that's trying to hold the pelvis, you'll lift the leg so far, and that feels about as far as it goes. Once you've been there a few seconds, actually you can then lift a little bit further. It's almost like structures that were beginning to pull on the pelvis to make it move, relax a little bit, and then you can just get it that little bit higher, and then you bring it back down. So that's a good example of a controlled Pilates move. Let me do it with the left leg, so I'm balanced, you see it the other way. So again, keep the rib cage lifted and open, lift the leg up, don't let the pelvis tuck under. I've held for a few seconds, and then, yeah, actually it will nudge a little bit further. I'm still keeping neutral, I've lifted the leg, and I'll gently release it down. So that's a very simple Pilates style exercise. I'm just using awareness, get the curve in the back, keep the curve in the back, lift the leg up to do that. Hold it, and that's a good challenge in itself. Balance is a good worthy challenge. Balance is a skill, it's a motor skill, it's an aspect of fitness that does diminish with age, it diminishes with injury history, particularly injuries to the legs, and it's something that we should all practice from time to time. So standing on one leg is good exercise in its own right. Doing it with the balance and control of lifting a knee, perfect, because you're getting the check of the natural curve. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the muscles. So that's getting the spine in the right position and keeping it in the right position. And when I reposition everything and I lie down on the mat, I'll show you some other examples of when the pelvis, the pelvis can go that way, the pelvis can also rotate that way, and it can also hitch up and down that way, and their movements I want to control. When I've got the pelvis in the right position, level and vertical, I want it to stay there. So we'll talk about that perhaps more when I'm lying down. Let's talk a little bit about the musculature. We have this corset muscle that I introduced before, transversus abdominis, the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, and these tiny little muscles in the spine here. All when they're firing, create stability through the core and therefore in the spine. So when I've got the back in neutral, I want those muscles to be firing to do their job, to keep the spine in its position. Now, if you imagine these muscles, they're postural muscles, which means they are used to, or they're evolved to, work a little bit all the time. Something like biceps, we fire when we're doing bicep curls in the gym or lifting something up, but then when you're not lifting anything, they get a bit of a rest, we're not doing much with them, so the muscle eases off. The core muscles are used to, they have a different structure of muscle fibres to be able to work a little bit all the time because you need some postural support all the time. Now when you do certain movements, you need more support for the spine. So for example, if I'm standing upright, back in neutral, just minding my own business, not doing a great deal, probably the musculature here, because I do this a lot, is firing about 20% of its full maximal effort possible. It's doing a little bit of work all the time as a background level. If I then bent down to pick something off the floor, imagine I've got some sort of box and some sort of weight there, my muscles need to do more work as I come down here to keep the back supported. The muscles have to do more work, those core muscles, to stop the spine losing its shape. So here I'm working about 20%. As I go down, I'm going up that scale, 20, 30, 40, pick up a big job, big box, it might be 80% of the effort, staying 80%, come back to the top, then I've got to the top, I'm still holding the weight, probably now it's about 40% because I'm still, although I'm not moving, I'm sort of static with the spine, but because I've got a weight in front of me now, there's a bit more effort needed to stop me sort of slumping forward. So the amount of contraction of these muscles needs to vary in response to the amount of work they need to do. So if I'm keeping myself still, they need to fire a little bit. If I'm lifting a heavy weight, they have to fire a lot more. And that's one of the motor skills that we develop with Pilates, in the sense that what I'm trying to do is getting your brain to be able to work out that graph. You know, 20% when I need it, 40% when I need it, 60% when I need it. But when I no longer need it, switch it back down to 20%. Let's talk about the 20% because we actually need that as a motor skill. Many people who have chronic back problems don't actually have their core muscles switched on a little bit all the time. So I'm going to switch on my core, I'm going to show you how to switch on my core, and then that becomes another skill that you can practice. So my transverse abdominis, when it fires, basically it's the muscle that will give you the hourglass. Because it's radial, it goes round this area. When it fires, it sort of flattens the lower abdominal area, it brings in the waist a little bit because it is radial, it's circumferential, round here. So as it muscle fibers shorten, it draws you into an hourglass shape. So what you need to do, if you imagine, if I squeeze my transverse abdominis as hard as I can, everything is coming in, that's my 100%, and then I relax that. If you can watch my hands, let me do that again. So when I draw everything in, the fingertips get closer, and then when I relax the transverse abdominis, the fingertips move a little way apart. Now, to be 20%, what I mean is, I just need them firing a little bit of that journey. So if I can switch mine off, which is quite hard, because I'm not used to having mine on 20% all the time, but if I switch them off a little bit, there we go, and I draw in 20%, my hands just come in a little bit, because they're firing, and then that little bit is what I carry on doing. I want to keep my hands here doing it, but here, if I'm wandering around, that's what I'm keeping going all the time. Okay, so how do you achieve that when you're not used to doing that? It is quite hard. I'd say it's the hardest skill of Pilates. Of all things, probably the hardest skill to know when you're firing transverse abdominis, when you're firing correctly, when you've got the right engagement for the body and what you need. But essentially there are things we use as analogies or cues to try and get this. One of them is this idea of little chains. There's my belly button. If I imagine on the belly button, above, below, and maybe 2 points below, there are chains inside me that are horizontal. And there's a chain on the side here that's coming in radially at the side. So I've got these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chains. And I'm basically using muscles inside me, pulling those chains in towards the centre of my body. And I want to pull those chains in at the side, in at the front, and just do it 20%, so a fifth of what they can achieve. And that's me engaging my transverse abdominis. Now, one way we can achieve about a 20% engagement is say to someone, squeeze everything in as much as you can. That's 100%. Then release it halfway. That's 50%. Then release half of that, and that's 25%. So there I've achieved a bit of contraction by saying, put it all on, halve it, and halve it again, and I've got about 25%. So that's one way of achieving it. Another analogy we have, if you imagine one of those weightlifter belts you often see, or you may have seen guys in the gym, with several, well, let's say it's got 10 holes in this belt. You then squeeze your tummy as if you're doing up the 10th hole of that belt. Then release it to the 5th hole, then release it to about the 2nd or the 3rd. That's another analogy we use. We often, and I use this in the teaching, I talk about cough and hold. As part of the cough reflex, you fire your transversus abdominis. No, that's probably not a great thing to be doing in the current coronavirus situation because people might misinterpret the cough. But if you're doing this at home, that's absolutely fine. Coughing engages your transversus abdominis. So sometimes actually if you place your hands over the lower tummy and cough a few times, you feel that firing of the transversus abdominis, and that's the engagement you need to have for your 20%. So think about your 6 chains pulling in, halving twice. Think about this belt with 10 notches releasing down to the 2nd or 3rd notch. That is the sort of firing that we do. The pelvic floor in a similar way, and that actually fires as part of the cough reflex as well. The pelvic floor, for all of us, it's the musculature we use to stop yourself peeing partway through and the musculature to stop yourself passing wind. So imagine you're squeezing to stop both of those things happening. And again, you can do a full squeeze, tense my shoulder, relax my shoulders, then half that again, and that's then your sort of 25% of your pelvic floor. So that's how we get this residual engagement of those core muscles. Squeeze it on, full on, halve it a couple of times, or imagine 10 notches and release to the second or the third. That's the way to get your resting residual contraction of your core. And then when you do an exercise, you can fire it more as the exercise requires you to keep the body still, or the pelvis still. And then when you finish the exercise, or finish the challenge part of the exercise, let it come back to 20%. But don't ever let it get less than 20%. Get used to that little bit of firing all the time. That residual 20% is the key bit. So we talked about getting the spine in neutral. We then talked a little bit about getting these muscles, particularly the transverse abdominis, the pelvic floor, to fire, to keep it in that position. So they're your basic building blocks. And then that's what we exploit, that's what we develop when we're doing Pilates exercises. Okay, so that's the introduction. Let me just think there's nothing else I need to cover before I move to coming down onto the mat. So I'm going to reposition things, get the mat, I'll get myself on the mat, move the camera so you can see me more closely on the mat, and let's look at things down there. Okay, so let's move the position of the body to lying down like this. We call it semi-supine. I'm not quite sure why it's semi, because I am supine, but I suppose because my legs aren't flat, it's acknowledgement of that. We do a lot of the Pilates exercises in this position, and many people would know this as the sit-up position, but it's one position we use very often in Pilates. Just in terms of placement and positioning here, I position my feet so that I've got roughly a 90-degree bend at the knees. I position the feet so that my knees are hip distance apart. What I mean by hip distance apart is that these bony prominences, part of the pelvis, sort of define the line that goes to the middle of the kneecap on each side. So that's the positioning there. The shoulders, the back of the head are down on the mat. Some people, if they've got restriction in the neck, what you'll find is when the head's down, their forehead slopes down. If that's the case, you place a book under your head so that the forehead looks horizontal. So just a pile of a book or a pile of magazines or something, just to get your forehead horizontal. The shoulder blades, they rest down on the mat, and an analogy we often use, imagine that you're lying on a beach of compacted sand. Imagine the sand when the sea's just retreated, and so it's quite compacted. Put your shoulder blades so they're firmly into the sand, and so if you got up, you get a nice crisp-edged triangular imprint for each shoulder blade in the sand, and that gives you good placement. And I've got the forehead, as I said, forehead horizontal here. Now, in this position, we can do the pelvic tilt. I'm in the standing position under the pelvic tilt. Well, I can do it here. And the pelvic tilt here is slightly different because I can alternate, because I've got awareness, there's a floor here now. I mentioned the door, I don't think I've got a wall, I don't think I've got a flat bit of wall here to show, but I can show you on the floor here that in neutral, I've got a little bit of space between my lower back and my neck. Not gaping daylight, but I could just about wedge my fingers under the small of the back. When I perform a pelvic tilt, and notice I put my hands on the pelvis to do this, I can alternate between pushing the lower back into the mat, notice the pubic bone has come upwards, going back to neutral, which has restored that little bit of space, and then go the other way, creating the gaping daylight under the small of the back. Now, for some people that is painful, so often we would encourage people not to go too far that way. If you've got good range in your pelvis, do that, but don't overforce that. The critical thing, the critical part of the pelvic tilt is from neutral, where the pelvis is horizontal, raising the pubic bones just so you push the lower back vertebrae into the mat, that's called imprint, and then release to come back to neutral. Now, it should be a nice smooth move, but hopefully that looks nice and smooth, it's under control. And the critical thing is I'm not using anything else. So some people, when they do it, they push through the feet, they thrust through the feet. Sometimes they do it by shunting the body up and down the mat. Now, just like in the standing position, when I arched my back backwards or I bent my knees, you can achieve a pelvic tilt by cheating.
both of those things I showed you here are cheating, and ideally you want it to happen without moving the spine. So be aware that the head, again using this analogy of the compacted sand, your head doesn't slide up and down the sand, it stays fixed in position whilst you do the movement. That's a good indicator that you're probably focusing the movement into here. So pelvic tilting is a great practice exercise. Neutral, bit of space, raise the pubic bone so you lose the space called imprint, where you imprint in the lower back again. Think about the sand, that impact, compacted sand, and the vertebrae are making an impression into the sand in imprint, and then you release coming back to neutral. You can make pelvic tilting more difficult by, if you have one leg in tabletop, for example, that leg can no longer contribute to stability or effort of the pelvic tilt. So actually achieving a pelvic tilt without swinging this leg with one leg in the air is actually more challenging. I'm having to fire my core muscles, and some of the big abdominal muscles that would do a sit-up, they have to fire as well to achieve the pelvic tilt in that position, because I haven't got any stability from that leg. So that's a way of making a pelvic tilt an exercise and a more challenging exercise. And similarly, if I have both legs raised like that, neither leg can contribute to stability. So actually achieving a pelvic tilt there without swinging the leg. If I put my hand there, you can see the pubic bones coming up. I'm imprinting back to neutral. Rather than doing that, that achieves the movement, but I'm not using my tummy, I'm just swinging the legs to do that. So just be aware of pelvic tilting, you want it to happen from the right bit, the right musculature. Now I mentioned in standing that the pelvis can move in tilting like that way, but it can also turn that way, and it can also hudge up, so I'm not doing that very well, hudge up and down the mat that way. Well, let's talk about that one. And often in Pilates exercises, I will get you to move a leg in a way, and usually it's laterally to the side, which if you haven't got control, would cause the pelvis to roll to one side, and yet I don't want it to. So I'm going to have to learn how to use musculature to keep the pelvis down. Let me give you a very specific demonstration of that. So I get my pelvis in neutral, I've got my leg, we call this tabletop, 5 verticals, chin horizontal. Notice I'm putting my hands to check what the bony crests here are doing. And as I take the leg out to the side, I'm monitoring that this one here isn't lifting. So if I'm doing that under control, I'm checking the right side, it's the left leg that's moving, the right side isn't lifting. If I do it without control, if you watch my right hand here, because I've gone too far. And so when we do a lateral movement, on the first set of exercises I do a lateral movement as one of the exercises, I don't want the pelvis to lift on that side. So I'll take the leg as far as I can, pause, and then bring it back. And that's doing it under control. We tend to do things without breath, so I'll perhaps in another video talk about breathing, but let's just for the moment say I'll take a breath in, and then on the out breath, take the leg out to the side, just as far as I can, knowing that if I went a little bit further, that would lift. So I've gone to the limit, hold while I breathe in, and then as I breathe out, to come back to centre. So that's an example of a Pilates exercise. Remember this principle, get the pelvis in the neutral position, but then do something with the arms and legs, which if there was no control, would take the pelvis out of position, but what I'm doing is putting in that control by using my core muscles so the pelvis doesn't move. Now, when we do an exercise, we will always do either both sides at the same time, but more usually we do one side at a time and then switch and do the other side, because you do need to make sure your body is symmetrical. But you will often find that your body doesn't feel symmetrical. You will often find that an exercise is easier one side than it is the other. Because we're footed, we're handed, left-handed, right-handed, we're therefore footed, we don't use our body symmetrically. So certain sides, certain movements are easier than others because of the way we use our bodies naturally. So when we do an exercise that focuses on one limb at a time, one side of the body at a time, you will often find one side is easier than the other. So just be aware of that when you're doing exercises. And in a home environment, i.e. not a class environment, you probably want to do a few more reps on the side that is actually weaker to give you that balance. In a class situation, I'll always try, I'm hopeless at losing count, but I'll always try and do the same number each side to offer symmetry. But of course, if you're tailoring the routine to you, you do more on the side that is weaker. So that's a good example of an exercise, a Pilates exercise, that leg, bring the leg up, and when you take it out to the side, you just make sure the other side doesn't lift, the pelvis doesn't rotate that way, and then come back like that. An exercise which, for example, challenges the pelvis in that direction is what we call the leg float. I can demonstrate the leg float. The leg float is quite a precise movement. It looks a simple movement, but many people get it wrong to start with because the brain isn't fully aware of properly what the limbs are doing. It's not a challenge we often do in our natural lives. But when you do a leg float, I move from the hip joint, bringing the thigh to vertical, shin to horizontal. Hold there while I breathe in, and then as I breathe out, slowly let it come down. So you notice the amount of bend at the knee doesn't change. I am moving from the hip joint. That is the leg float action. And if I did that without control, let me just show you. I'm going to put this leg down. Now let me go too far. So I've got neutral here, a little bit of space. But if I go too far, I lose neutral. I push the back into the mat. I've lost the control. So just be aware, when usually in exercises we maintain neutral, then do all that you can to make sure the pelvis doesn't move. And the basic principle of any Pilates exercise, when I teach my classes, and therefore probably any videos I do will follow the same pattern, rather than doing a routine that's beginners, routine that's intermediate, routine that's more challenging, I will give options on exercises. So this is the version that we all start with, and I'll say something like, well, if you want to make it more challenging, what you could do is this, and so you could do, and I'll show you some examples of that to make it more challenging, but those who are at the beginning level, stay with the easy version, or take more rest. You know, in a class I might do 8, 10, 12 repetitions of an exercise. Well, if it's right for you to do 6, just do 6, and then hang on and wait, and then catch us up when we move on to the next exercise or do the next round. Let me show you an example of natural progression. I meant to bring a loo roll, because I was going to show you how, assuming you've got an abundance at home, I was going to show you how you're going to use a loo roll to make an exercise more challenging. I'll save that for next. Oh, there might be one in the toilet. I might go and just demonstrate with one from here. But let's for the moment say I haven't got a toilet roll. Let's take that leg float exercise. Out breath to float, hold when you breathe in, as you breathe out, release down. Now I can make that more challenging in increments. One thing I can do, although it's only a small change, the leg that's not floating, if I have it straight, it's harder for me to press through that leg to achieve stability. So I have to work a little bit hard to stop the pelvis moving. If I had a loo roll, I could put the left foot lightly on the loo roll, trying not to squash it, and all of a sudden I have to work a lot harder to stop my back from lifting. I'm really thinking, remember that graph, like 20% all the time, but try and make it more contraction when you need it. You know, I'm going up 70-80% there with that leg on the loo roll. Probably will be slightly easier on the loo roll because I'm dangling the leg. If you had a loo roll to rest on, it'd be easier. And then we've got, if I could put that leg in, this is not the working leg, I'm just putting that in tabletop. I will then do the movement with this leg, and I actually am having to work really quite hard to keep the pelvis neutral. So I've used body weight and just positioning of the legs to make the same movement, in this case, the floating of the right leg, more challenging for my tummy, and therefore more challenging for the core muscles. So that's how we use body mechanics, and that's the thing I will do, because most of you won't have any props at home, although I might improvise if we want to have weights and things. But generally speaking, if we can use body weights to make the exercise more challenging, that is what we're going to do. Similarly, if I'm doing a lateral exercise like this, remember I was doing the exercise where I took the leg out to the side, I'm stopping the pelvis lifting on that side. I can do a similar theme to make it more challenging. I can have that leg straight, so that when I do that movement there to stop this hip lifting, it's a little bit harder because the leg isn't able to support as much. Or I can have it propped on a loo roll, imagine it's on the loo roll, and then as I go out to the side, it's just a bit harder. Or I could have the leg in tabletop, harder again. Or I could have the leg straight out, that's an even harder challenge. That one, the lower that is to the floor, just even holding there, I'm having to work the tummy quite hard, and then taking the leg out to the side, I have to get even more challenge. So you'll notice when I do most of my Pilates exercises, they are the sorts of things that I do to make the exercises more challenging, but the basic principle all the time is trying to keep the pelvis in position, get it in position, keep it in position, fire your muscles a little bit all the time, but then when the exercise comes to challenge, you then ramp up the contraction of those muscles to keep everything stable. Well, I hope that makes sense. That's hopefully a good introduction to what we're going to be doing in the Pilates routines. It makes sense if you've not done it before, hopefully. You'll understand why I choose exercises and give different versions of exercises to increase intensity, why I talk about neutral spine, why I talk about keeping the pelvis still. So join me on the journey, we'll do a few videos. This space is great, but if we have lockdown, I may not be able to get to this space, but I'll improvise something at home
I'm sure. But whilst I've got this space, I will do different routines, and we'll see how we go.
Just as a little addendum to what I've just done, I'm just checking in the right position. I've borrowed a loo roll from the toilets here. So if I wanted to make one of my leg floating exercise a bit more challenging, I could have my foot, don't squash the loo roll, that's the key thing. I can touch the loo roll, don't squash it. And to get this leg up without losing neutral, I'm having to work harder here. So it's a great little prop. That's why you're panic buying, isn't it? Because you're thinking about all the Pilates you're going to do. You've got your prop here to make the tummy muscles work harder to keep the pelvis in neutral, the lower back in its natural curve. So you can use a prop, it could be a cushion, it could be a rolled up towel, whatever you've got to hand, but it just makes that exercise a little bit harder. And I say, the thing about it, if you put the full weight into the loo roll, you'll squash it. And then it's a little different from the foot being on the floor. But if you let yourself touch the loo roll, but don't squash it, that's when you get the challenge for the exercise. So yes, improvise, you can often use something around the house, like a loo roll or something, to make the exercise more challenging.